Good morning, everyone. We're just going to take 1 minute before we kick off in earnest, just to let everyone get out of their previous meetings and into this one. Okay, people are still coming in through the front door, but we might kick off in earnest now because I've got 3 screens of meeting participants present. So let's start. Laura. All right. Just briefly by way of introduction, welcome to today's first WA Electricity Consultative Forum for 2026. My name is Aidan Barker. I'm the Head of Government and Stakeholder Engagement for AEMO here in WA, and I'll be your chair today. So we're looking now at being about halfway through Jiran, which is the Noongar season before we get into the real winter wet weather. But for those of you based in WA, you already would have seen a couple of fronts come through already this just in the last few days, showing us that yes, well and truly the season has changed, and we can see that in the power system as well, as temperatures during the daytime have dropped, and we're seeing quite material changes in low temperatures in the evening, and also changes in wind output as well. I'm joining you today from Wadandi Noongar Budja, Wadandi Noongar land. Many of you will be in Wajak land in Boorloo, Perth, but for people everywhere, AEMO acknowledges the traditional custodians of the lands, seas and waters across Australia, and on the wisdom of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, elders past, present and embracing future generations. And with that, we'll kick off the meeting with today's online housekeeping. Most of you would be familiar with these rules, but for those of you who are need a brush up, given that we haven't had a forum in a while, please mute your microphone during the presentation or you'll be muted. Leave your camera off. Generally, it's not so much a bandwidth issue as it is a distraction. However, if you're asking a question, we'd love to see your face and obviously be able to speak it yourself, which you'll be called upon. We are using the Q&A function for today's session, so you'll see that at the top of your screen in the taskbar. Please put the questions in there rather than the meeting chat. I'll keep an eye on the Q&A as we go through today. We'll also have some time set aside at the end of today's session if there's something that you wanted to ask but had not had an opportunity to do so during the course of presentations. You'll see that we're recording the session, and that recording, as well as the presentation, will be published on our web page as well. And of course, as always, we welcome feedback on how we conduct these sessions via that email there below. I also do just need to, as always, call attention to competition law. It's not AEMO's competition law, but competition law more generally, and a few rules of thumb, which is that participants in these sorts of discussions ideally keep to matters that are part of the published agenda. So keeping to the point, making independent unilateral decisions about what you do and say, your responsibility. But also, if you see something, say something. If you're concerned that something may have breached competition law, please do put your hand up and alert us to it. And as a general rule, don't talk about anything that's commercially confidential. Things to do with your business by way of its strategy, your customers, or bidding strategies, etc. Okay, next slide. And today's agenda, after I'm done shortly, I'll hand over to Mike Reid to provide us with a bit of an update around the Major Projects Working Group, followed by Mike Brennan, who will talk about the RCM, and Rebecca Pedlow-Collins, who will be talking about the upcoming WEM Electricity Statement of Opportunities, before handing over to Nick to talk about the upcoming real-time market insights forum. We'll then tie off the meeting with a brief description of WEM procedures that are on HOP and are upcoming for us before closing off, possibly before 10:45. And with that, I will hand over to Mike.
Thanks, Aidan. Hi, everyone. Quick update from me. So the Major Projects Working Group, we last met late in 2025, and at that meeting we covered off 3 implementation assessments. There was the one on MSDC3, which was the most recent project to upspec the market surveillance data catalogue for the ERA and EPWA. The DTS and SCED offline tools implementation assessment, that one covered off the new tool to be used by particularly the control room for rerunning major events. The DSP participation implementation assessment was the last of those, and we got consultation feedback on the second 2 of those. So the MSDC3 one was published as the first and final, but the second 2, we talked to the MSDC members, got some feedback and finalised those earlier this year. At that December meeting, we also covered off a minor revision really to the implementation roadmap. So in that roadmap, we showed some relatively small revisions to the budgets and the schedules for a couple of projects that were in flight or to commence shortly, but didn't really discuss any major revisions to the longer term outlook for our 3-year work plan. Now, since that meeting, we've finalised and published all those implementation assessments, as I said. We've also released and in fact completed consultation on an implementation assessment on an upgrade to our ST Parser tool, and we have just started this week consultation on a second draft implementation assessment on a project called Operational Forecasting Improvements, which is about upspecking our forecasting, the forecasts that we use in real-time operations. That one's got another 2 weeks or so to run, I think, and hopefully we've got another implementation assessment in the pipeline, which will be coming out shortly. I'll mention that in a second. At our next MPWG meeting, which is currently scheduled for the 22nd of May, we'll present a more complete revision of our implementation roadmap, and so that will go further than the last revision did. It'll reach out into those out years right at the back of the 3-year work plan and show a more complete picture of what we're prioritising to work on over the next 3 years in terms of our capital works. At that same meeting, we'll close off the feedback that we've received on the ST Parser implementation assessment and that operational forecasting improvements implementation assessment, and we will either be consulting at that meeting or wrapping up the results of out-of-session consultation on a 3rd implementation assessment, which I'm hoping to release soon, and that'll concern the Public Data Uplift project, which is a project aimed at improving the public data site and improving the WEM data dashboard. So looking forward to the meeting in May, and happy to take any questions on MPWG business.
Okay, no questions in the chat, Mike.
Okay, thanks very much, everyone.
Okay, while Laura brings up the slides again, just to remind people, of course, that if you have any questions regarding the content that's already been discussed today, but didn't get a chance to answer them, we have got that space at the end. And then, as always, for those playing along at home listening to the recording, if you've got any questions regarding content from today's presentation, please don't hesitate to email us. Okay, with that, I'll hand over to Michael Brennan, who's going to provide us with an update on the RCM.
Great, thanks, Aidan. So today, good morning, everyone. Thanks for your time. My name's Michael Brennan. I'm a market analyst in the WA Capacity Investment and Assessment team and at AEMO. Today, I want to give you a clear picture of where the 2026 RC cycle is right now, what the expression of interest process has told us, and where we sit on the timeline and what that means for anyone with a project in this cycle or thinking about one. And so we'll move through the cycle timeline, the EOI submission trends, the conversion data, and also provide a snapshot of the 2026 EOI summary, and also discuss about the technology breakdown and some signs of project maturity, and also at the end have a geographic picture and to discuss. So first of all, the EOI process. So it's our first activity for proponents and AEMO to undertake as part of year one RC cycle. So through this process, AEMO invites applicants to provide information on the amount of energy producing system or DSP capacity they intend to make available 2 years in advance. So you might be thinking EOI submissions might not be relevant to you or might not be that impactful, as of course there is the direct IFC method that you can apply. However, EOI has many benefits for you and as the applicant, and also for AEMO as well. For AEMO, we get to understand and have early engagement with facilities that may not have a complete structure of their facility configuration, and they want to engage with us to understand how best this will fit in the RCM. Secondly, for market participants, early engagement means they can have greater certainty and time to prepare for their CRC application. Noting that without an IFC and indicative facility class or indicative facility technology type assigned to the facility, they cannot proceed with a CRC application. And thirdly, for market participants, providing an EOI early means that the validity and the submission time of the EOI will influence their facility's place in the priority order if there is a tie break during the network access quantity calculation process, and which then does impact the facility and can have an influence on the amount of capacity credits assigned to it. Now, in regards to this timeline, so this slide is a map for context on the EOI process, which we're going to discuss. I'll briefly walk you through what this timeline represents. The RC cycle runs across 4 years, and this timeline here represents year one. And year one is really what the procurement year. It really is where all the action happens for us in our team. When we have capacity is identified, assessed, and certified. Everything happening on this slide is year one based activities. So moving from the timeline left to right, we see that on the 15th of January, AEMO published a request of expressions of interest publication. And this outlined exactly just the outlook on future capacity requirements and latest available information. We secondly also provided the application form for EOIs and invited all applicants that have new facilities to submit. Moving along here, we can see on the 1st of, we went through and on the 1st of April, there was the EOI summary, that was published. And then on the 19th of on the 14th of April, the CRC window opened just last week. And then the following activities, the direct IFC process is closing on the 19th of May. So if you haven't submitted an EOI and want to participate this year, please do so. However, this is closing soon, so please submit your direct IFC soon. On the 24th of June is another key point, is where the CRC window closes, and it's a hard deadline for CRC applications. That, I'll move on to the next slide, please. Just to give a brief snapshot of the EOI processes in the last few recent years, you can see how there's quite a large uptick. Starting from 2023, this was a mandatory year that applicants had to apply for. So you can see it's quite a large trend. However, in 24-25, you can see it dipped lower, and then most recently in 2026, we had 85 submissions, of which, funnily enough, we received 65 applications on the last day, on the 3rd of March. So there was quite a lot for us in our team to process and to assess those facilities. And so it was quite an interesting time. On top of that, you notice that the upgrades, we didn't have many upgrades this cycle, and mainly new facilities came through. Another interesting point is that we had 9 new market participants and that registered for the RCM. And I'll just move to the next slide, thanks. However, like when you see this, seeing that we had quite a large uptick and quite a large interest, it's also important to know how the EOI process translates into assigned capacity credits. In the chart here, you can see the most recent years, 23 right up to 2025. And you can see that there's, on a positive note, that a decreasing trend in the rate of EOI applicants that do not submit CRC applications. So previously it was quite high amount that wouldn't translate into CEC capacity credits. But now it's down to 56% of that. So the next stage for EOIs is to the CRC stage, experiences the biggest uncertainty in terms of megawatt changes. So you notice that more than half of the capacity submitted into the EOI process doesn't come through the CRC process. And so there's multiple reasons outside of this. EOIs are just potential capacity. And so it's more just an expression of interest at this stage for them. And it's more, they potentially later down the track may reapply for capacity CRC application in a couple of years' time. And so it's just more of a signal to RCM on potential CRC that may come through to the market. And go to the next slide. So again, when you see the amount of peak capacity that comes through, you can see that it was quite a large amount. It was 3,747 megawatts came through. Again, want to emphasize that there's quite a large trend of this not translating into actual CRC applications and assigned capacity credits, with over half not actually translating into this, at least. In terms of the applications themselves, we received 104 EOI submissions, which is almost doubled from last year. So we had quite a large uptick and interest in the EOI process this year. And there's multiple reasons for this. That could allude to. Firstly, there could be the BRCP increasing year on year by 35%, and that could also be more attractive for investors to invest into the market. We also had more clearer direction and provided additional workshops and communication about the regulations and the compliance required for CRC applications. And so of the 104 applications coming through, there was 85 that were primary, and there was 2 that were invalid, and that was mainly in relation to not meeting the requirements of the EOI process under 4.2.7 of the ESM rules. We'll go to the next slide. Okay, so just moving through this quickly. The main key points from the EOIs that we received in this year. So there was quite a large capacity mix, and however, it continues to be strongly weighted towards ESRs. This isn't a one-off anomaly. We've been seeing this large trend, upwards trend, in having more battery storage dominating the WA pipeline for multiple cycles now. Now there's multiple reasons for this. And secondly, we see IGS, the intermittent generating systems, contributing approximately 8%. So this includes solar farms, wind farms, and any of those intermittent generating systems that we receive. And then thirdly, there was the non-intermittent generating system that we had as well. You can see here the underlying technology in the second graph below. You can see that there was 1,848 of standalone batteries and 920 in multi-technology configurations. And so, for example, we're seeing a few more hybrids come into this system, quite a large uptake in facilities becoming hybrids. So in perspective, we've seen there was 2 hybrid applications last year, and then for this cycle, we've seen 10 applications for hybrids this year. And so there's hybrids meaning like solar plus storage or wind plus a battery, those type of configurations that we're seeing come into the market. Now, if you compare this, I was just looking back on historical, when in 2010, there was a few like coal that was largest proposed generation technology at 220 megawatts. And today you can see here that there's no coal and in this applications at this stage. In addition to that, there's also 34% of new non-DSP capacity that year. So if we move on to the next slide. Now, this slide just drills in particular into the narrative that I was talking about, hybrids and single versus multiple technology split. You can see here that as a standalone technology, there's approximately 73% of proposed capacity comes in, and the right-hand bar on the chart is the one to focus on. Now, mostly standalone batteries or standalone dual fuel generators. And then on this, there's 27%, which is 1,013 megawatts, is multi-technology. And this comes in from like multiple technology configurations, and just as I was discussing earlier about the hybrids. And you can see that solar and ESR, nearly the entire multi-technology total makes up this amount. And we'll just move on to the next slide. Now, in relation to this slide here, you can see the table here. There was quite, as the nature of EOIs, there's EOIs by its nature is quite very non-committal process. And so the makeup of committed facilities in our definition, which is facilities that have commenced construction or have completed construction. There was approximately only 1% of the facilities that came through had commenced construction or completed construction. Of the remaining facilities, we've had a look into their access proposals and environmental applications that they've made to gauge how progress these facilities have come through. And so approximately half of the facilities, or half of the megawatts capacity that's come through, there was a submissions have already been made for access proposals and also for environmental approvals granted. And then for submissions under assessment still, there's only 300 megawatts where not all the environmental approvals have been granted and are still getting processed at this time. The early stage applicants, there was just over half of that capacity where neither the access proposal offer has been made or the environmental approvals have been completed. And so it gives you a bit of a sense of the progress of where these facilities are coming through at this stage. Go to the next slide. This over here in this geographical location, we notice that there's the EOI capacity is heavily concentrated in the southwest corridor. It reflects the proximity to existing infrastructure and load. It also signals and demonstrates the amount of batteries and also is proportional to the size of the bubble, represents the approximate size of the megawatts capacity. And so the larger it is, the greater the facility or the megawatts in that region. And as you can see, batteries have dominated in these areas along the southwest corridor. And then there's also some areas where there's hybrid facilities of solar and battery as well. Move to the next slide. Thank you. So up to now, we've had a few parts of engagement with market participants already. So early in March, we had a CRC process and workshop with applicants and had really good engagement with them. And just recently, we've also had the relevant RLM workshop because due to the RLM changing, there was a lot of interest in understanding how the new RLM works and also the IER requirements. And just right now, our next steps is going to be CRC windows been open for over a week now since the 14th of April. And so we really highly recommend participants to engage with us early, put through CRC applications early for us, then we can do a preliminary screening for them until 10th of June, and we can provide feedback until that date. So we recommend applicants take advantage of this. So if they've got any queries or any questions about that, they can get that addressed. And I will finish up with, I think there's one last slide, I believe. If any of the participants have any further questions, or feel free to reach out to us through our inbox. We also have updated RCM-based web pages on the website that you can reach out and provide multiple points of contact to get help and multiple areas of resources as well. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Michael. We've actually had a few questions in the chat, some of which I've already responded to or can respond to relatively quickly now. So Wayne asked, given the state recently directed utilities to sign PPAs, why aren't all those megawatts reflected as part of the EOI process? The response is that the EOI process this year is not compulsory, and in fact, those facilities can come in later in the process via the IFC pathway that was mentioned earlier by Michael as well. I don't know if there's any further questions on that. Ganesh asked around what AEMO might need to do to prevent changes to the BRCP in future, while assuring that there's sufficient capacity still on the WEM. Just make the point that AEMO doesn't determine the BRCP and only receives it as an input, and that's a role for the ERA. We note that we do have David Dixon, from the ERA here on the call today. I don't know, David, whether that's something that you want to speak to, or alternatively, we can let that lie.
Happy for someone to send through a question via email, and I'm happy to respond. If I can drop my email in the chat.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you for that, David.
No worries.
And then finally, we've got a question from Neil Canby. I'll actually ask Neil for you to speak to this. Asking for a little bit of a clarification, read content that was on slide 15.
Yeah, and it's thanks, Aidan. It's not just on slide 15, it's in the report itself. It talks about the term access proposal and all necessary environmental approvals have been applied for and granted. And then in the slide itself, it uses the word offer. Obviously, offer is a very key word with Western Power, because an access offer is the key that we all chase when trying to connect to Western Power. That's very different to the question last year, and we certainly went back and looked in the EOI questionnaire and couldn't understand how you could determine that that was an access offer. Usually it's the access application has been submitted and is being processed is the question that we respond to. So I just wanted to confirm, because that would suggest if it is an offer has been made, there's a lot of capacity sitting in the market that people aren't progressing with.
So thanks, Neil. I'll just answer that one so basically the EOI summary report is based off 4.2.7, and so it's based off if these facilities are not yet committed, meaning under construction or commenced construction, then it's asked for to be segregated into 3 buckets. And these buckets are basically if an offer by Western Power to enter into an arrangement has been made and all necessary environmental approvals have been granted. So, and then secondly, the applications for both access proposals and environmental approvals have been made. And thirdly, no access proposals have been applied for, or some of the approvals have not been applied for. So I could, if you submit your question just through the inbox to us, I could probably go into a bit further detail on this, and then provide a bit more substantive answer to your question.
No, happy to. It just seemed the words changed from the previous 2025 report, that was all. And we were just trying to understand if that had changed the assessment.
Okay. Yeah, I'll look into that.
Great. Thanks for that, Michael. Thanks, Neil. There's no further questions on this part of the presentation. So with that, we'll move on to an update on the WEM ESU with Rebecca Pedlow-Collins. Rebecca.
All right, thanks very much, everyone. Thanks, Michael. That was a really interesting presentation. Just to introduce myself, I'm Rebecca Pedlow-Collins. I am the Acting Manager for the WA Future Systems Planning and Forecasting team, and I'm sitting in this role while recruiting is going for a full-time manager for the role. But I've previously been working in the certification team, including with Michael. So if you've been around the reserve capacity mechanism for the last few years, you've probably run into me in one forum or another. Today I'm giving an update on where we're at with the electricity statement of opportunities. It's a bit of a redux of the FRG forecasting reference group if you've been, but I think it'll be useful to make sure that everyone's on top of where we're at exactly. So for people who aren't experienced at reading the ESO, this is a document that we put out annually, and it's one of our biggest publications. It informs the investment opportunities that are needed to maintain a reliable supply of electricity or capacity for the Swiss over a 10-year outlook. And in particular, it plays a really important role in setting the reserve capacity requirement 2 years in advance. So this year we are in 2026 setting the reserve capacity requirement to the 28-29 capacity year. Throughout the process of developing the ESO, we do extensive engagement with WA government and a number of other stakeholders to ensure that we've got the most accurate, up-to-date and robust information to include, and we, on the basis of this, forecast both supply and demand for the electricity outlook for the Swiss going forward. So we, as I mentioned, we've held 2 forecasting reference groups, and you can click through that link and find a more extensive version of the 10 minutes you're going to get from me today on some of the forecasts that we've been using. But there's a few things that we specifically want to touch on in terms of methodology and forecast outcomes today that are really important for people who are thinking about participating in this year's cycle. So the availability duration gap, which is quite an important piece of the puzzle in terms of how many capacity credits new batteries or ESRs will receive, has been drafted on a preliminary basis and is currently at 7.5 hours. That's 1.5 hours for the availability duration gap, added to the 6 hours duration of last year for a total of 7.5 hours. The relevant level methodology, which has been presented in a number of forums, has also been discussed, and the impact of that is currently forecast at 240 megawatts of capacity. We're explicitly looking at the impact of virtual power plants, specifically through synergy and residential batteries, and that's been considered for the first time in terms of what that changes of peak demand in the system. And we've done that in consultation with our stakeholders there. And then finally, we're also doing our modelling in-house this year. Obviously, there's a lot of focus on costs and making sure that AEMO is doing things as efficiently as possible. We're always looking at ways to optimise and get the best value while still providing a really robust methodology that everyone can rely on for these investment outlooks. So the report's currently under development, and we're definitely noticing, as I'm sure everyone on this call is, that we're in a general environment with increased volatility and uncertainty. So we're making sure that we look really hard at things like fuel supply this year, just so we can see the potential of the impacts there. We're also considering things like the environment for project development, including the supply chain issues. Next slide, please, Laura. So the maximum demand forecast, and as I mentioned, if you've been to the FRG, you might notice this one has already been presented in that context, but we've got a slightly higher forecast coming through for our summer POE in the expected case. But overall, we're seeing some tightening of the difference between the lowest and the high cases, which is good. We've got a steady increase in demand, and that's following just both the general trend in WA for economic growth and driving. The electrification trend, there's a lot of businesses that have looked at fossil fuels are switching over to electricity. And there's some background around new industries as well that we can touch on, but that includes things like data centres and the impact of things like hydrogen. The actuals that we're looking at as well, just to give a bit of context for last summer, sitting between 10 and 50% of POE, and that's due to the relatively mild summer that we've just had, which I, for one, was very grateful for. All right, next slide, please, Laura. So the maximum forecast that we're looking for demand over winter has also increased a little, although the expected case is relatively similar to last year. We're still seeing an increase over time following the trend towards electrification, as well as overall, as I mentioned, there's a growth in WA and relatively comfortable economic circumstances. We're seeing a slightly higher baseline there, and that's reflecting the fact that we are seeing higher winter peaks, and that in part is due to the trend towards electrification for cooling and heating. And then we've obviously got the economic circumstances in the background around large industrial loads, which are equally impacting the trajectory going forward. Again, we've got a comparison with the actuals for last year, and we did have a particularly chilly winter alongside a mild summer last year, so that has impacted our starting point for these forecasts too. If you could move on to the next slide, please. So the availability duration gap, this is obviously something that we have looked at last year, and it's a continuation. That nothing has actually changed in terms of the methodology, but we do acknowledge that the gap between the publication of the ESU and the 2 weeks that we have until the CRC applications come in is relatively short, and as particularly for people who are looking at having either an ESR alone or an ESR as a component of capacity that they're bringing in, this is of interest. So what we do for that is all based on the rules. It's all referenced in Appendix 11 Part B, and we build up to peak and we work out exactly what would be required to compensate for the electricity that we are getting from those batteries, and we turn that into measuring the bottom of the peak that is required to service all of that need. So we've got an example there from the 2018 reference year, and I think it is something that's a lot easier to understand when you look at it visually too and understand the slicing of that peak. But as I mentioned, this has been really impacted by the large proportion of ESRs that we are getting onto the system, and that is what is driving that lengthening requirement year on year. If you could move on to the next slide, Laura. So this, as I mentioned at the start of the presentation, is currently our estimates are looking at a 7.5 hour ESR duration, and that's driven by the increase in the availability duration gap. We've run that at the moment on the basis of the numbers that we had for last year, and then some increases that we're predicting coming in this year in terms of additional ESR capacity. The important thing as well is that the ESR duration is grandfathered when facilities come in for 10 years. So even though we build up this availability duration gap, the facilities that came in 2 or 3 years ago stay on their 4-year ESR duration for the first 10 years that they're in operation. And that leads to a requirement for us to put in an uplift to the RCT that compensates for this gap between the requirement and the grandfathered component that we're looking at in the ESR capacity. And we're on the back of that, we are looking at an increase of around 90 megawatts in the ESROD uplift to the RCT. Do want to emphasise that this is not yet a final result, but it's indicative, and we do want to make sure that everyone's really clear this number is likely to increase, and this is the sort of quantum that we're seeing in the modelling so far. But there is a possibility that it's not 7.5 when the report is increased, and I do encourage everyone to check the report when it comes out to get the actual number. Okay, if you could move on to the next slide. So the RLM, as we touched on, gives us a uplift of around 240 megawatts based on the last run. Now that's a little bit lower than what was reflected in the request for expressions of interest, but I'm sure as anyone who's done extensive projects in rolling out modelling knows, over time those results start to converge on a point as you do more and more runs, and that's what we're seeing as a fairly consistent result now based on last year's capacity credit assignment. We expect that there's going to be more intermittent capacity coming in, as some of the comments in the chat have reflected, and we're not in a position at this point to make any comment about how that might impact the capacity of facilities that we haven't seen in previous runs, but we're being very transparent and making sure that everyone's very clear about the methodology that's being used. We are considering the best way to describe this in the narrative, but we'll make sure that that is really clear. And the logic behind all of this, which I think is important to understand, is that the previous RLM was a really good option when we had a relatively low proportion of VRE in the system, of variable renewable energy. But as the proportion is coming up, there was definitely a push to get something that better reflects the contribution that intermittent generators make during these periods. And This has been brought in because it aims to reflect better the contribution that intermittent generators are making to the RCM. So it's part of the overall push to make sure that we're accurately reflecting the contribution that all different types of generation make to the Swiss, and making sure that we've got an appropriate analysis of the way that contribution plays out. This has also been covered at the FRG, and there was also a session yesterday that slides are available for. So if anyone has specific questions about this, please feel free to review those resources, but also please feel free to contact us by email or other means to understand that more. If you could move on to the next slide. We've also got some initial reliability results coming through. For those people who are new to reading the ESU, when we set the reserve capacity target, it's got two limbs. One of those limbs is based on a peak capacity on a POE 10, probability of exceedance 10, which we then add some margins to, including the possibility of loss of supply, regulation raise, and that storage duration lift that I've also mentioned. Secondly, we've also got Limb B, which looks at a limit on the annual unserved energy up to and that's 302% of forecast annual energy consumption. Thirdly, we've also got Limb C, which defines a flexible reserve capacity target. We haven't done much of the modelling down that end, so I'm not going to talk about that, but I'm moving from discussing things that primarily impacted Limb A now to Limb B. And then the greater of Limb A or Limb B is what sets the reserve capacity target. So historically, we've done those assessments through third parties, consulting firms, but this year for the first year we've brought those in-house, and that's going to be a really exciting development for AEMO. Not only is it more cost effective, but it'll also allow us to do potentially more in-house work throughout the year and consider more of the volatility and interesting changes that we're seeing as the energy transition continues. Could you move on to the next slide? So there's some key points to consider in terms of how we do that modelling. So we look at 15 weather reference years, and that's important because obviously the weather plays an increasingly important part in how much capacity we need, but also how much capacity we have through those renewable resources. And through our modelling, we look at not only at capacity, but we also consider some of the other essential system services that are required to deal with some of that volatility associated with the energy transition. The model has a minimum demand threshold of 300 megawatts, and we are looking at that, especially around the levers that we have to control that. One of the things, obviously, that we do have for demand now is a very large proportion of ESRs in the system, which is part of how the system is dealing with that minimum demand challenge, what we used to call the solar duck, and I believe it's now being called the solar crocodile in a lot of the posts I'm seeing around the place. And we're also measuring demand from hydrogen production. So that gives us an overall picture. You can see a diagram on the side. And as I said, I'm doing a relatively light touch on this because I need to move on and there are other people to talk. Could you move on to the next slide? To give you an idea of how we're going through and looking at the VPP, we're looking at, in terms of residential batteries, how they reduce that peak demand in that final, those peak periods, especially around residential usage, and then we're using that to influence how the reserve capacity target is built. If you could move on to the next slide. Thank you for that. I'm going to pass on now to Nick Nelson. If there's any questions, please let me know.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Beck. That's a fantastic overview. There are a couple of questions. So the first one comes from Glenn Neal. Glenn, I'll just have you speak to that question if that's okay.
Yeah. So I noticed if it does increase to 7.5 hours, let's say, for 2027, 2028 capacity year, does that mean a new benchmark reserve capacity price is going to be reissued from ERA? How does that piecework.
Okay, so I don't want to talk too much for David here, who I know is on the line. No, the final determination has been determined, and that's been published. This, on the other hand, will trigger a review of the benchmark reserve capacity technology provider, which will be done through EPWA. That's all laid out in the WEM procedures that the ERA has got on their website, and I'm sure David's already posted his email. If you've got any questions about the timeframes associated with that or the process involved, that the ERA would be happy to talk you through exactly how that plays out.
Okay, so okay. I'm just trying to work out how reserve capacity pricing is applied when that piece is uplifted. That's all.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Can I?
Sorry, we can take.
Thanks, Dave.
Sorry. Yep.
Just make one clarification. It's Roger from the ERA. The ERA does not make the decision on the reference technology. It's EPWA that does that. But if that happens, then ERA will make the determination that will be different to this year.
Okay, thanks for that, Rajat. We might move on from that, and if there are any further questions, David's indicated he's very happy for you to send them through by the email they've posted in the Q&A section and is in the chat. The next question comes from Wayne Trumbull. So he's talking about the RLM specifically. Wayne, do you want to speak to your question?
Do I understand correctly, Rebecca, that you're looking at least with this recalculation of the RLM, a 340 megawatt increase?
No, 240. 240.
240. Okay. And would your expectation be that then that we will need to, as a market, capture 240 megawatts of more capacity to support that reserve target?
So in terms of the supply side, we will account for that in our estimations of the supply, and then obviously that factors into the information that AEMO publishes around the expected supply and demand balance. We don't factor it into the RCT directly because that's dealing with the demand. It's a supply-demand balance we're looking at, and there's nothing that intrinsically changes that side of the equation by changing the RCT, by changing the RLM. Sorry, all of these acronyms even catch me sometimes.
I completely understand. I can't keep up with them at all. I guess my underlying question here is, and I think I asked it during the forecasting seminars for the new statement of opportunities, have you considered at what price do you begin to see demand destruction? In that we are now approaching somewhere close to $200 a megawatt hour delivered. I know that you take account of broader economic forecast, but do you consider the point at which people decide not to expand their refineries and things like that?
Look, it is something that is dealt with through the FIR process where we do discuss some of those matters. I think what you're touching on is probably a slightly broader philosophical level question that might be more within the remit of policy. But in terms of how that impacts into forecasting, there is a component of economic outlook that focuses in on that. And then there's also, as I mentioned in FIR, there is a little bit more detailing that goes through both in the GSO and the ESO around cost pressures on industry. Happy to go through that offline if you'd like, but there's sort of two aspects of that. There's the granular aspect of how we consider it in forecasting, and the RCM design question, which might sit a little bit better with a broader conversation than I can probably tackle in the next 5 minutes.
No, you've answered my question. I will look forward in the report. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Wayne. Thanks, Beck. And finally, we've got a question again from Neil Canby. Neil, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, sure, Aidan. I did attend the RLM session yesterday.
Oh, great.
I'm not sure I'm particularly much wiser than I was at the start of the session.
Oh, dear.
But given the number of hybrids that you've talked about in the EOI, and just interested to understand if the hybrids will be treated as separate fleet, or will, if it's a solar battery hybrid, the solar be part of the solar fleet, and will there be separate fleets based on the battery capacity, the energy obligation that year that the battery is effectively certified for?
Sure. So the technologies are all considered in their own fleet. So ESR is considered as a fleet, with intermittence considered as a fleet, with NIGS considered as a fleet as well. So we don't have a separate fleet for hybrid. The capacity associated with each of those will be considered in their individual fleets. And sorry, the second part of that, you were asking if it gets passed out in terms of duration. Is that correct?
No, so the RLM obviously applies to how much the capacity the intermittent generation on that
Yep.
item gets. But if it has battery associated with it, it can behave differently to the rest of the fleet of intermittents that it's been compared with, which obviously has a limit of what that entire fleet can provide. So how does that get catered for if you can control your plant to better suit the demand profile of the market?
Sure. So as I mentioned, the technologies are all put together in a fleet. So that means, we are bundling things under those banners, and there's a lot of variation in operating models and operating philosophies under that. Under the thermal generators, we've got coal plants on one end, we've got diesel peakers on the other, we've got baseload gas and peaker gas in the middle too. So we are bundling them all, and there's a certain averaging that will happen as a result of that that's considered on a fleet basis, and we're not passing out the difference between the individual sort of operating modes, operating philosophies of each of those subcategories that you could possibly think about within the technology types. But I'm sure if you're interested in further modifications to the RLM or things that could consider in the future, there's pathways to discuss that through working groups with EPRA as well that you could contribute to.
Okay, thanks, Rebecca.
Thanks, Neil. Thanks, Beck. And finally, we've got Noel Schubert with his hand up very patiently.
G'day, Noel.
Thanks, Aidan. Thanks, Rebecca. I just wanted to clarify Wayne's question about the 240 megawatts of increase from the RLM. Wayne, I understand that if the RLM comes out and allocates 240 megawatts of extra capacity credits to the renewable fleet, it means we need 240 megawatts less capacity in the market, if I'm correct.
Sorry, was that for me or for Wayne that you were looking to get clarification?
Well, I think Wayne thinks that because the RLM is coming out with 240 megawatts extra, that we're going to need 240 megawatts of extra capacity from somewhere. But I think it's the other way around. I think we need 240 megawatts less capacity from somewhere else.
Yeah, so if I wasn't clear, the way that we account for that 240 megawatts doesn't affect the RCT, and it increases the supply associated with those. So where we see that come through on the ESA will be in the supply-demand balance.
Yeah, so it increases the supply, which means we need less from somewhere else then.
Potentially.
Yeah, and noting that all capacity must ultimately be paid for, which I think was where Wayne's question was coming from. Yes, it is. There will be a signal regarding the need for less capacity, which may ultimately impact on what comes through. But in addition to that, further to the supply-demand balance, to the extent that we are over the RCT, then there can be a reduction in price resulting from that surplus as well. So there are a few in play.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Noel.
Great, thank you for that, Beck. That was a fantastic presentation, some really good questions there as well. So with that, we'll hand over to Nick Nielsen for a bit of a preview for the upcoming RIF.
Thanks, Aidan. I've shared my screen. I trust that someone will let me know if you can't hear me or see my screen. Good morning, everyone. My name is Nicholas Nilsson, and I manage the real-time. For those who don't know me, I manage the real-time market monitoring team here in the WEM at AEMO. Our team is responsible for the day-to-day function of the WEM dispatch engine, making sure it's running smoothly, and also, of course, monitoring all of the market outcomes that come out of the real-time market. So what I'm here to do today is just give a really brief preview of the content that we're planning on sharing in our upcoming RIF. And if I just flick forward to the next slide. So the Real-Time Insights Forum, we run it quarterly. The next one's coming up on Thursday, the 14th of May. We're going to run it as usual as a purely virtual meeting from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m., as I said, on the 14th of May. If you don't already have an invitation and you would like one, you can send an email to waelectricityforum@aemo.com.au. And if you have any feedbacks or suggestions for content you'd like in this one or any future RIFs, please send feedback to wa.rtm@aemo.com.au. Those emails are up on the slide there. So just to give a quick preview, our planned agenda for this quarter is pretty packed. We'll start with, we'll give a bit of an overview of the WEM section of the Q1 2026 QED, which will be coming out very shortly. We'll give a bit of an overview of some early observations from the rock-off safe limit change, which occurred in February. So for those who don't know, the rock-off safe limit was increased from 0.5 to 0.75 hertz per second towards the end of February. So we'll give a bit of an overview of the changes that we've seen in market dynamics as a result of that. We'll give an overview of the tolerance range review report. We have recently published a draft report on our website for consultation. So if you're interested in having a look at that and perhaps providing some feedback, please jump on Google and search for AEMO WEM Tolerance Range Review Report, and you'll find the draft report there. But we'll also give a bit of a verbal overview of the findings in this RIF. We'll talk a little bit about some recent market dynamics that we've observed, particularly with respect to battery dynamics, and we'll give an overview of the interim outage intention plan, which I believe has recently been published. That's our plan. I will note, just as a quick caveat, that the agenda is subject to change without notice, so it might look a little bit different on the day, but this is what we're working towards at the moment. Happy to take any questions if there are any. Otherwise, I'm happy to pass on to the next presenter.
Thanks for that, Nick. Much appreciated. And that looks like it's going to be a really interesting and actually quite packed agenda as well. So just one thing I do want to note, the first time I think we've provided a more detailed or fulsome look of upcoming RIF content. We're actually trying to time these forums such that we do have a WAECF prior to the RIF, and we're able to advise on what that content will be, but also just further to some stakeholder feedback, trying to make sure we're not doubling up too much on content. So when a QED comes out, for example, we will provide a high-level update on the content of that, but part of that will be pointing to that next RIF, and where we'll be deep diving into that content more fulsomely. So you can be assured that you're not attending two forums and just getting the same content. They will be quite distinct, and we're planning them in conjunction with each other. And with that, I'll hand over to Sarah Graham for an update on WEM procedures.
Thanks, Aidan. This will be a very brief update. For those who don't know me, I'm Sarah Graham. I manage the WA Reg Affairs team here at AEMO. Thanks, Laura. So yeah, we've had a pretty busy few months with procedures, as always. Since the last WACF, we've progressed 12 all the way through from consultation to commencement. There's another one as well that we're currently finalising for commencement. It's closed consultation. So thanks to everyone who's already attended the ABCWG meetings in the past, asked questions, provided submissions. We really appreciate all the feedback we get. Just a note, you now actually have to register to attend ABCWG meetings. So if you want to make sure you want to be on that list, hit us up at the inbox address on the screen there, and we'll add you. And just a reminder that really to make our WEM procedures as good as possible, we really value your input. So make sure you head to our WEM procedure page to see what procedures are open for consultation, and there's a full explanation on how you can provide submissions. Okay, Laura, to the next slide. Okay, so I won't go through the full list of procedures here, but I guess if you look to April, we actually commenced 3 procedures just in the last few weeks: the relevant level method, certification of reserve capacity, and settlement. So please head to the One Procedure page if you want a bit more of an explanation as to what's changed in those procedures. We have lots of materials that will guide you through the items that are relevant to you. Okay. And yeah, as I mentioned, there's reserve capacity security. That's closed consultation now, and we expect to publish probably by the end of this week, maybe early next week. Coming up in the next couple of months, we have the forecasts on scheduled operational demand and rule participant registration processes. We also have quite a few procedures that are due for the 1st of October. So we'll have several more in the coming months. So stay tuned. Thanks, Aidan.
Thanks for that, Sarah. We've got a quick question from Rhiannon, who's asking, and maybe Nick, you could help us out with this, what the expected publication date is for the QED upcoming.
Yeah, and I believe it's the 30th of April, but I'm just trying to chase up with some colleagues behind the scene to confirm that. But if it's not the 30th of April, I think it'll be, plus or minus a few days next week.
That's great. Thank you for that, Nick. And we had a hand up with B-Joy George. Oh.
Apologies.
Oh, no worries, hands down. Okay, not much of a chair update this forum, other than to say we do have a number of upcoming forums. We've already talked about the upcoming RIF on the 14th of May. Also have a second CRC process information session on the 14th of May, same day, followed shortly thereafter by a WADR market participation forum. So an update on Project Jupiter and other happenings in DR land. MPWG, as Mike said, is upcoming on the 22nd of May, with a to be confirmed date for an upcoming WEM ISU webinar around the date of publication. And we anticipate at this point, again, consistent with the process and timing with the RIF forums, that the next WA ECF will be held on the 23rd of July. So pencil that into your diaries. Okay, we do have a couple of minutes left now. If there are any outstanding questions from presentations provided today, I can't see anything in the chat, but we'll hold online for maybe 10 seconds if anyone's just gathering their thoughts or wanting to put something in the chat, or their hand up, which is probably the best way to go at this point. Okay, Glenn Neal.
Yeah. Hi, it's one to Rebecca if she's still on the line. Is there any view yet, preliminary view yet, on what the ESROD will look like for the 2028-29 capacity year?
Okay, it may be that Rebecca's gone offline, in which case we can take that question on notice, and I'm sure Rebecca will be happy to get back to you on that, Glenn.
Yeah, thanks.
Oh,
Right.
sorry, I am on the line. I was struggling with my mute button for a second. So what was the question there?
Just if there was any update on the ESROD for 2028-29 capacity year.
In terms of the ESROD uplift, that is going to be something that comes out when we've finalised the ADG. That's an outworking of that process. So yeah, we don't have a final on that yet, no.
Oh, okay, so it's only the 27-28 that you're giving signals on.
Okay. Yeah, as if you go back through the slides, we've given you an indicative number that it is going up, but we can't give you a final number on that. That is an outworking of the availability duration gap calculations.
No worries. Thank you.
Thanks for that. And Wayne, you've got your hand up.
Thank you. I think this is again to Rebecca. It's been brought to my attention that the transitional payments for capacity credits, that arrangement ends, I think, in the 28-29 year. What effect does AEMO see when that relatively large portion of the capacity pool reprices to the higher level?
Yeah, look, that's a really interesting question, and I know that it's something that our policy people are considering at the moment. So it obviously there is a substantial portion of the market that's still on the transitional price, and so that price rolls off for the certification that will happen the 2028 cycle, which applies from 2030. 31. So it is something that's being considered, but I don't think there's a final position that I can give you on what the intention is around that and how that might be accounted for. But I definitely encourage you to keep bringing that one up in conversations when you're dealing with Energy Policy WA and other people.
So just to make sure I've got it correct, they don't reprice in the 28-29 year. That's just the first year it rolls off. So it's the 2 years following that we would see presumably the repricing of that capacity.
So yeah, this is the 2026 cycle that we're in from this year. Then it was a 10-year application of the transitional price from the 2018 cycle. So yeah, then in terms of applicability, it's for the capacity year that occurs 2 years after that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Wayne, for clarifying that. I had a little heart attack. I'll take my hand down now.
Great. No heart
We're not aiming for any injuries at the end of this. No.
No energy sector professionals were harmed in the development of this forum. All right. Thank you for that. We're pretty much at time now. Please, like I said, if there's any questions that come out of today's forum presentations, please don't hesitate to ask. We're also very keen on getting feedback about how we run these things to make sure that they're an effective use of time and that the information that we're bringing with you is of use. So with that, I'll say thank you very much, everybody, and we'll see you on the other side. Thank you.
Thanks,
everyone. Good session.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.